Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to the ancient world. So, take a breath, dim the lights, and let yourself sink into the pillow, because we're heading into the dusty, shimmering, endlessly complicated kingdom of Egypt, and more specifically, into the life of one of history's most famous women, Cleopatra. Now, when you hear her name, you probably imagine glamour, golden thrones, eyeliner sharp enough to slice through limestone, lounging on silk cushions while Roman generals collapse at her feet. And yes, there was some of that, but mostly, Cleopatra's life was stressful. She was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which, fun fact, wasn't even Egyptian. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals who, after his death, decided, yes, I'll take Egypt, thank you very much. And the family held onto it for nearly 3 centuries by clinging tightly to tradition. And by tradition, I mean inbreeding. The Ptolemies were famously committed to marrying each other. Sisters, brothers, cousins. It was all fair game. Because apparently, when your family tree is more like a wreath, you feel safer on the throne. Cleopatra herself was the product of this delightful practice, which means she probably had some genetic quirks that weren't showing up in the marble statues. So, already, we're not talking about a goddess descending from the heavens. We're talking about a stressed 20-something woman trying to keep her family's collapsing dynasty from crumbling faster than a stale loaf of Egyptian bread. Let's start with her appearance. Ancient Roman writers couldn't decide if Cleopatra was dazzlingly beautiful or not. One described her as enchanting. Another hinted she had a rather large nose, which, of course, is the polite historian's way of saying, not really a supermodel. But here's the important bit. Her looks didn't matter nearly as much as her voice. Every record agrees she had a hypnotic way of speaking. Not just charming, but persuasive, musical, and apparently irresistible. Imagine if someone could read your tax bill to you in such a soothing tone that you actually enjoyed it. That was Cleopatra. And she needed that gift because she spent her entire life negotiating with men who wanted to either marry her, conquer her, or occasionally both. She came to power at 18, alongside her younger brother Ptolemy 13. The problem was that he was about 10 years old. So naturally, the court officials tried to rule in his name. Cleopatra, however, was not interested in being sidelined. She was pushed out, went into exile, and then, in one of history's great dramatic entrances, came back. And how did she make her return? Well, this is the famous story. Julius Caesar was in Alexandria at the time, and Cleopatra had herself smuggled into his palace, rolled up in a carpet, or perhaps, more accurately, a linen sack. Either way, she was delivered like a surprise package to Caesar's chambers, and when it was unwrapped, out stepped Cleopatra. Was this actually true? Hard to say, but historians agree on one thing. It's exactly the sort of stunt she would have pulled, and it worked, because of course it did. Caesar, a 50-year-old Roman general with thinning hair and a reputation for being easily flattered, was immediately captivated. Cleopatra used her charm, her wit, and possibly just the sheer audacity of the whole carpet thing to secure his support. And with Caesar backing her, she was restored to the throne. Now, remember her younger brother, Ptolemy 13? Things didn't end well for him. After some battles, He drowned in the Nile, which is perhaps the ancient world's polite way of saying the problem solved itself. Cleopatra then ruled as queen, first alongside another younger brother, and later with her own son. Yes, her son, who, just to keep things confusing, was also named Caesarion, because of course she named him after Julius Caesar. Now, you might be thinking, ah, a royal child. Surely this will stabilize things. Spoiler alert, it did not. Egypt was still a minor player compared to Rome, and Cleopatra's entire reign was spent trying to keep Egypt independent while the Romans squabbled among themselves, which meant that Cleopatra had to pick her allies very carefully. After Caesar's rather dramatic assassination, stabbed 23 times on the Senate floor, Cleopatra had to switch partners. Enter Mark Antony, another Roman general, less polished than Caesar, more of a soldier's soldier. He was charming, fond of wine, and had that sort of reckless energy that makes for excellent parties but questionable political decisions. Cleopatra and Antony became lovers, partners, and, depending on which Roman propaganda you read, either a glamorous power couple or the ancient equivalent of a tabloid disaster. Together, they had children, twins in fact, plus another son later, which meant that Cleopatra's household was becoming increasingly complicated. She had Caesar's child. She had Antony's children. She had siblings who were constantly plotting against her. Honestly, if you pitched her life as a Netflix drama, producers would probably say it's a bit over the top. But let's drift back to some of the less glamorous details, because Cleopatra's daily life, like all royals, wasn't just gold and parties. It was also deeply practical. She spoke multiple languages, including Egyptian, something most of her Ptolemaic ancestors hadn't bothered with. She needed to manage food supplies, negotiate with priests, deal with floods, droughts, and the constant possibility of plague, all while trying to keep Roman generals happy. Her reign lasted 22 years, and in that time, she faced rebellion, famine, war, and the general exhaustion of keeping Egypt afloat while Rome loomed over everything like an overstretched empire that couldn't mind its own business. She had to be clever. She had to be ruthless. At one point, she had her sister executed at a temple, just to make sure no rival claims to the throne survived, which sounds harsh. But in the world of dynastic politics, it was more or less standard housekeeping. Of course, we can't forget how it all ended. After years with Antony, the pair faced off against Octavian, soon to be Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Antony and Cleopatra lost at the Battle of Actium. Fleeing back to Egypt, their power slipped away, and when Octavian's forces closed in, Antony took his own life. Cleopatra followed soon after. Now, here's the famous detail: the ass. Supposedly, Cleopatra allowed a venomous snake to bite her, ending her life in a suitably dramatic fashion. But historians doubt this. For one, smuggling a live snake into your chambers is a logistical nightmare. And two, snake venom doesn't usually kill quickly or cleanly. It's more likely she used poison concealed in something more practical, perhaps a hairpin dipped in toxin. Either way, it was a theatrical exit, and Cleopatra knew the value of a good ending. So what are the crazy facts about Cleopatra? Well, she was Greek, not Egyptian. She probably wasn't as conventionally beautiful as Hollywood insists. She may or may not have arrived in a carpet to seduce Caesar. She juggled multiple lovers, multiple children, and multiple crises. She spoke more languages than most modern politicians. She had her sister killed in a temple, and in the end, she chose her own death rather than parading through Rome as a prisoner. It's glamorous in the retelling, but exhausting in reality. She lived constantly on edge, playing politics at the highest level, surrounded by betrayals, propaganda, and sand. Always sand. The ancient world was nothing if not gritty. And that's just the beginning of our drift tonight. Cleopatra's story is only one thread in the long, tangled fabric of royal misfortunes. Because for every glamorous queen with eyeliner, there's a king with gout, a prince with a tragic jawline, or an emperor who couldn't string two decisions together without collapsing into paranoia. So, as we close this part, just imagine Cleopatra, not the marble goddess of statues, not the Hollywood siren, but the tired queen late at night, surrounded by scrolls, advisors bickering, children crying somewhere in the palace, Romans sending demanding letters, and the Nile flooding a little too much or a little too little, trying to keep her dynasty alive, while history sharpened its knives. And with that image, let's drift onward to the next royal fiasco. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake after Cleopatra's long night of scheming and poisoned hairpins, congratulations. If not, that's fine. That was the point. Tonight, let's drift a little further into a colder, windier place. The highlands of medieval and early modern Europe. A world of castles, smoky halls, and clans with more grudges than clean shirts. The years between the 12th and 16th centuries were a particularly difficult time to be a woman of a noble family, or as they were called in many places, of the clan. The men were usually busy fighting, plotting, or drinking themselves into oblivion. The women? They were busy holding everything else together, which makes their lives fascinating and also quietly miserable. Let's begin with one of the core facts of noble clan life. Marriage was rarely about love. It was a tool, a chess piece, a way to grab land, secure alliances, or end feuds. If you were the daughter of a clan chief, your future was probably mapped out before you could walk. And no, it didn't matter what you thought about it. At best, you might get a husband with decent teeth. At worst, you'd be bundled off to live with a man twice your age whose idea of courtship was showing you the sheep he owned. One of the more notorious examples comes from Scotland. The MacDonald and Campbell clans, bitter rivals, decided to make peace in the 15th century. And of course, how do you make peace? By marrying off the daughters. One poor MacDonald girl was shipped to the Campbells in a grand ceremony. She smiled, she curtsied, she did everything properly. Within a year, the feud flared up again, and the marriage was all but abandoned. She became the forgotten casualty of politics. History doesn't even record her name, just the daughter who was married off, which tells you everything you need to know about how much agency these women had. But it wasn't always so bleak. Some clan women did manage to carve out space for themselves. Take Isabel Macduff, Countess of Buchan, in the early 14th century. While her husband supported the English, Isabel made the audacious decision to crown Robert the Bruce as King of Scots. She literally rode into Scone Abbey, grabbed the ceremonial robes, and placed the crown on Bruce's head. Bold, dramatic, treasonous. Naturally, the English captured her, locked her in an iron cage, and hung her from the walls of Berwick Castle, because apparently, subtle punishments were not their strong suit. She survived in that cage for years, becoming a grim tourist attraction. People would walk past, point, and whisper, "That's the woman who crowned Bruce." A terrible fate, but also proof that some clan women weren't just pawns. They could, and did, change the game. Still, for every Isabel, there were dozens of women stuck in the grind of survival. Daily life in the clans was a strange mix of hardship and ceremony. You might have silks from France, but you were still living in a stone hall with smoke drifting through the rafters and the occasional sheep wandering inside. As a lady of the clan, you'd be expected to manage the household. That meant overseeing servants, making sure food was stored for the winter, arranging marriages for your children, and negotiating with neighbors who might want to steal your cattle, which was basically everyone. One of the quiet ironies of the age is that women often held more actual responsibility than the men. When the men marched off to war, or more often, squabbled endlessly in the fields, the women ran the estates. They kept the land producing, handled disputes, and even, in some cases, led defenses when the men failed to show up. But history, being written mostly by men who liked to brag about their own adventures, tended to leave these details out. So we're left piecing together glimpses. A letter here, a complaint there, a story half remembered by a bard. The 15th century gave us Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII of England. While not Scottish, she belonged to the broader European clan culture where dynasties rose and fell on the backs of marriages. Margaret was married off at 12. By 13, she gave birth to the boy who would become Henry VII, which is horrifying to think about. She nearly died in childbirth, her body so small and young that it was permanently damaged. She never had another child, and yet, she spent her entire life maneuvering politically to ensure her son took the throne. Quietly, carefully, relentlessly. Without Margaret's scheming, there would be no Tudor dynasty, which means no Henry VIII, no Elizabeth I, no endless films about the Tudors. All of it began with one exhausted, fragile, determined teenage mother. Back north, another remarkable clan woman was Agnes Randolph, better known as Black Agnes. In the 14th century, her husband left her in charge of Dunbar Castle while he went gallivanting. Naturally, the English arrived to besiege it. Agnes didn't flinch. When English siege engines hurled rocks at the walls, she simply ordered her maids to sweep the debris away, mocking the attackers. When ladders went up, she had boiling oil poured down. She became a legend for her stubborn defense, holding out until the English gave up in frustration. Her name, Black Agnes, was whispered with equal parts admiration and exasperation. A woman who refused to break. But of course, not every story is quite so heroic. Many women of the clans found themselves trapped in marriages that were miserable at best, violent at worst. Dowries were paid, alliances secured, and if your husband drank too much or beat you regularly, well, the clan's answer was usually, "That's marriage." Divorce was rare, separation nearly impossible. A noble woman's duty was to produce children, particularly sons, and if she failed in that task, she might find herself quietly pushed aside for another wife or mistress. The saddest part is how many of these women disappear from history. Their lives were recorded only in genealogies, a line noting their marriage, another noting the birth of heirs. No mention of their thoughts, their loves, their heartbreaks, just names linked by dates. And yet, they carried dynasties forward on their shoulders. By the 16th century, women of the clans began to find more ways to wield influence. Europe was shifting. The Renaissance was spreading. Literacy was growing. Noble women started writing letters, keeping accounts, even sponsoring poets. Some became skilled negotiators. Others quietly ran their families' fortunes while their husbands played at war. In a few rare cases, women actually became clan chiefs in their own right, not because anyone wanted them to, but because all the male heirs had inconveniently killed each other in battle. Take Lady Grange of Scotland in the early 18th century, a bit outside our time frame, but too strange to ignore. Married into the powerful Grange family, she became an embarrassment to her husband, who decided the best solution was to kidnap her. She was abducted by her own relatives, hidden on remote islands, and kept prisoner for over a decade. Not because she committed a crime, simply because she was inconvenient. That, in a nutshell, tells you how precarious a woman's position could be. One wrong word, one stubborn opinion, and you could vanish into exile. So when we talk about women of the clans, what we're really talking about is survival. Survival in smoky stone halls. Survival in forced marriages. Survival through childbirth. Survival while men with swords and egos made decisions that affected everyone else. They were the keepers of families, the managers of estates, the quiet power behind dynasties. Occasionally, they burst into legend, like Black Agnes, or political importance, like Margaret Beaufort. More often, they remained in the background, but without them, the clans wouldn't have lasted a generation. And there's a kind of irony in that these women were raised to believe their duty was obedience. And yet, through that obedience, they became indispensable, holding together lands, marriages, and entire lineages while history forgot their names. They were, in their own way, the backbone of Europe's nobility. And yet, the history books leave them in the shadows. So, as you drift off, picture it: a windswept castle on a cliff, smoke rising from the hearth, a woman at the head of a long wooden table, balancing accounts, keeping the servants in line, watching her children squabble, and quietly preparing for whatever disaster tomorrow brings. Not glamorous, not famous, but absolutely essential. And with that, let's drift onward to the next royal catastrophe waiting just beyond the horizon. Hey everyone, tonight we're leaving behind smoky Scottish halls and riding south into Italy. Not the Italy of pizza and pasta that's centuries away. No, this is the Italy of velvet-clad dukes, suspiciously oily condiments, and banquets that were equal parts political theater and digestive hazard. The courts of Renaissance Italy, Florence, Milan, Ferrara, and of course, the Vatican, were obsessed with appearances. And nowhere was that obsession clearer than at their banquets. Eating was not just about food. It was a performance, a carefully staged spectacle designed to impress rivals, secure alliances, and occasionally make everyone else feel poor. Picture the setting: a great hall in Milan or Florence, tapestries hanging from the walls, depicting classical heroes who were probably less well-fed than the guests sitting below them. A long table, glittering with goblets and silverware that no one actually knew how to use properly. And at the head, a duke or a cardinal, wearing layers of silk that would make a modern tailor cry. Around him sat the noble families, all pretending not to hate each other, while servants scurried about with dishes that grew increasingly strange as the night went on. Banquets, you see, were designed to show wealth through sheer excess, and Italians of the 15th and 16th centuries were very good at excess. A typical court feast might last for hours, sometimes days. Guests were expected to sit through course after course, with the number of dishes reaching into the dozens. It wasn't just dinner, it was endurance training. The food itself was a strange mixture of genuinely delicious dishes and things no one should ever put in their mouth. There would be roasted meats, elaborate pies, marzipan sculptures, and mountains of bread, but also bizarre concoctions like peacocks roasted whole and then redressed in their feathers for presentation. Because apparently, nothing says refined culture like eating something that looks like it's about to fly away. In Ferrara, the Este family became famous for their theatrical dinners. They employed cooks who were practically engineers, building sugar sculptures the size of small towers. At one particularly notorious banquet, the dessert was a mechanical stag made entirely of marzipan. It could walk across the table and spout rose water from its mouth. Very impressive. Also entirely inedible, which tells you a lot about priorities. And then there was the Vatican. Popes, as you might expect, enjoyed their food. Not for nothing did Renaissance critics often describe the papal court as a feast disguised as religion. Pope Alexander VI, better known as Rodrigo Borgia, was especially fond of lavish banquets. His dinners included mountains of roasted game, fountains of wine, and sometimes, for entertainment, live animals released into the hall. Nothing quite says holy authority like watching a goose chase terrified cardinals around a table. The Medicis of Florence were no less ostentatious. They used banquets as political tools, inviting allies and enemies alike to admire their wealth. Dishes were often gilded, literally. Meat and pastries were brushed with gold leaf so guests could ingest a small fortune before dessert. It probably wasn't great for digestion, but it certainly made a statement. And if you vomited afterward, at least your sick glittered. Of course, all this splendor was underpinned by strict etiquette. The way you ate mattered almost as much as what you ate. Forks, for example, were a subject of deep suspicion. Yes, forks. Introduced into Italy from Byzantium in the 11th century, forks were considered decadent and even sinful at first. By the Renaissance, however, Italian nobles adopted them with gusto. Using a fork showed refinement. Not using one marked you as a barbarian. Imagine the pressure. Lift your food with your fingers, and suddenly you're the medieval equivalent of that guy who double dips at parties. Etiquette also demanded that you never show too much enthusiasm for the food. Eating too quickly suggested greed. Eating too slowly suggested weakness. And heaven forbid you spill anything on your elaborate velvet tunic, which, given the sheer number of courses, was almost inevitable. Servants were trained to watch closely and replace stained napkins before anyone noticed. The illusion of grace was everything. But the banquets weren't just about food. They were about theater. Between courses, there would be music, poetry readings, and sometimes elaborate plays staged right at the table. In Ferrara, Dukes staged miniature jousts with toy knights riding across the table. In Florence, actors dressed as Roman gods would descend from the ceiling on pulleys, reciting verses while guests chewed their goose legs politely. It was all meant to remind everyone that this family, this court, was cultured, powerful, and wealthy enough to hire people to dangle from ropes while wearing fake wings. The irony, of course, is that while the nobility were stuffing themselves with gilded swans, the common people of Italy were often struggling to get bread. Grain shortages, high taxes, and periodic famine meant that peasants lived on little more than bread, beans, and occasional cheese. Watching their lords hold banquets of 30 or 40 dishes must have felt like living in a bad joke. One chronicler dryly noted that the peasants of Florence dined on the smells drifting out the palace windows. Banquets also became stages for rivalry. If one duke hosted a dinner with 30 courses, the next had to host one with 40. If the Este family unveiled a sugar sculpture shaped like Hercules, the Sforzas had to unveil one shaped like the entire 12 labors. It was culinary brinksmanship, a war fought with roast capons and almond paste. No one wanted to be outdone, because being outdone meant being seen as weaker. And in Renaissance Italy, weakness was fatal. Not surprisingly, these feasts sometimes went terribly wrong. At one banquet in Milan, a mechanical centerpiece, a great clockwork lion, malfunctioned and burst into flames, setting the tablecloths alight. Guests panicked, wine spilled, and what was meant to be a majestic display ended with half the hall reeking of burnt sugar. Another time, in Florence, a giant pie was presented to the table, from which live birds were supposed to fly out gracefully. Instead, they exploded out in a frenzy, defecating on the guests before escaping through the rafters. It was memorable, just not in the way the Medici intended. And yet, through all the absurdity, banquets served a very real purpose. They displayed wealth, yes, but they also reinforced social bonds. To be invited to a ducal feast was an honor. To be seated near the head of the table was a sign of favor. To be left out entirely was an insult that could spark feuds lasting years. Food was currency, reputation, and weapon, all rolled into one. As the Renaissance moved forward, banquets only grew more elaborate. By the 16th century, sugar had become the obsession of the Italian courts. Sculptors were hired to carve entire landscapes out of sugar paste. Castles, forests, even miniature armies. Guests would admire them, nibble on them, and then throw them away, because by then everyone had tooth decay anyway. Meanwhile, physicians warned that such indulgence was unhealthy. Naturally, everyone ignored them. The irony is that many nobles barely touched the food. Too much eating was considered vulgar. Instead, they picked delicately at a few dishes, made polite noises, and left the real feasting to their servants. The banquet was not about pleasure, it was about performance. You showed that you could afford to waste, that you could host a feast with enough leftovers to feed a village, and then toss most of it into the refuse. Waste was the ultimate display of wealth. So, as you picture the courts of Italy, don't imagine cozy dinners of pasta and wine. Imagine instead a cavernous hall filled with candlelight and chatter. Imagine roast peacocks redressed in their feathers, golden pies hiding live birds, sugar sculptures sweating in the heat, and dukes pretending not to notice the mess. It was dazzling, absurd, and faintly ridiculous. which makes it the perfect backdrop for Italian politics. And with that, let's drift onward. Because if the food didn't put you to sleep, the next round of dynastic quarrels surely will. Hey everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to the 3rd century BCE, a time when China was being stitched, or perhaps forcefully stapled, into one empire. At the center of this process was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. He unified the warring states, standardized laws, currencies, and even the width of wagon axles. He also had the peculiar hobby of building things so large and exhausting that they nearly broke his own empire. The most famous of these projects, of course, was the Great Wall. Now, when you picture the Great Wall, you might imagine the iconic stone fortifications winding gracefully over mountains. That postcard view. The truth under Qin Shi Huang was less postcard, more misery. His wall was not the gleaming structure we see today. It was an earlier, rougher version, built mostly of rammed earth, mud, and the occasional pile of rocks shoved into shape by thousands of overworked laborers. It was less great, and more good enough to keep out nomads, hopefully. Still, Qin Shi Huang thought big. His empire had just emerged from centuries of constant war. Every neighboring tribe looked like a potential invader. So the emperor ordered the connecting of existing regional walls into one continuous defensive line. The goal was to create a physical boundary, a barrier that screamed, "This side belongs to me. And if you live on the other side, please don't come over here with horses." The workers who built this wall were not exactly volunteers. Most were conscripted peasants, dragged from their farms and forced to labor for months or years at a time. Others were prisoners of war or criminals, sentenced to wall duty, which sounds noble until you realize it meant carrying heavy loads of mud until your body gave out. Historical records estimate hundreds of thousands were pressed into service. Many never returned. There's a Chinese saying from later centuries, "The Great Wall is the longest cemetery in the world." Romantic, in a grim sort of way. Corpses of dead laborers were not exactly given respectful burials. They were often tossed into the very foundations of the wall, which technically makes the Great Wall both a monument and a mass grave. Qin Shi Huang probably would have called this efficient resource management. Let's pause for a moment on Qin Shi Huang himself. He was a man who truly believed in control. He centralized the government, standardized writing, weights, and coins. He even standardized thought, or tried to. Famously, he ordered the burning of books that disagreed with him and buried scholars alive, which is not usually listed in leadership manuals. But he also had a paranoid streak that made sleep difficult. He was obsessed with the idea of immortality. He consumed elixirs made of mercury in hopes of living forever, which of course had the side effect of slowly poisoning him. His search for eternal life probably shortened his own, a kind of cosmic joke. Now, back to the wall. Imagine the scene. Endless lines of laborers trudging through mountains and deserts, carrying baskets of soil, overseers shouting, whips cracking, the summer heat, the winter frost, the endless monotony of moving dirt from one pile to another. You can almost hear the sighs of exhaustion echoing across the plains. It was not a glamorous project, but in Qin's mind, it was the ultimate symbol of unity and power. Interestingly, the wall was not one unbroken line, but a patchwork of connected fortifications. Watchtowers dotted the landscape, allowing signal fires to be lit in case of attack. The idea was simple: enemy sighted, torch lit, message relayed down the line in a chain reaction of panic. It was primitive long-distance communication, a sort of fiery telegraph system. Of course, it depended on people actually staying awake at their posts, which history suggests was a recurring problem. Despite the suffering it caused, the wall did have some immediate effects. It slowed down raids from northern tribes, at least temporarily. It also gave Qin Shi Huang something grand to show off as proof of his power. But maintaining such a project was another story. Walls erode, crumble, and collapse. Constant repairs were needed, and as dynasties rose and fell, each one decided whether the wall was worth saving. Many didn't, which is why later dynasties had to rebuild it again and again. The iconic stone sections we see today were largely Ming Dynasty handiwork. 1500 years later, Qin's wall has mostly faded back into the earth, which feels poetically fitting for something made of dirt. Qin Shi Huang himself never lived to see much benefit from his wall. He died in 210 BCE, still chasing immortality. His death was kept secret at first, his officials hiding the body in a carriage filled with rotting fish to mask the smell. Not exactly the grand ending he probably envisioned, and his empire collapsed soon after. The wall, though, lingered, in fragments, a reminder of ambition, cruelty, and mud. Lots of mud. The image of the Great Wall is often romanticized today as a symbol of Chinese endurance. But under Qin, it was more a symbol of exhaustion, an emperor's dream, built on the nightmares of thousands. A line across the land, trying to hold back the chaos of the world, which, if you've been following history for a while, is always temporary. So, as you drift tonight, picture the quiet landscape of northern China, a wall of packed earth stretching across mountains, watchtowers silhouetted in the dusk, laborers huddled by fires, overseers pacing, the emperor somewhere far away, drinking mercury and dreaming of immortality, a man trying to build forever, while being undone by his own medicine. There's something almost peaceful about it. Almost. And with that, let's drift onward, because the next emperor, or queen, or unfortunate royal will surely provide more bedtime material.